think the sweetest call that I had heard was a officer's daughter who is in her 30s. Her father had passed away a few years before. And she just wanted, honestly, just somebody who she could talk to that would be similar to her dad to run something by. And the volunteer that took that call said to me, he said, all I could think about was when I'm no longer here, that I hope that my daughter calls to talk to one of our guys when she's struggling with something.
San Diego 911 emergency. You need to come right away. There's a man with a gun and it's loaded. Receiving emergency signal from 4 George 1141. We've got a white female down. We need paramedics code please. All available units roll code that way.
Welcome to the De-Escalation Conversations podcast. I am here with an absolutely amazing lady, Stephanie Samuels, and I want to introduce you to Stephanie. She is a police psychotherapist. She's been in private practice for over 35 years with law enforcement officers. She created CopLine that we're going to be talking about, crisis line for law enforcement officers only, 18 years ago as a pay it forward. And the heartbeat continues with the volunteers that share a servant's heart. And Stephanie, you absolutely have a servant's heart, and the level at which you operate, taking care of your patients, taking care of all the CopLine volunteers, taking care of CopLine. I don't know when you sleep, but I suspect it's about 4 or 5 minutes here and there. I think you probably catch a lot of cat naps. But welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I'm honored that you're giving us some time. And I know that your time is really limited and really valuable. So thank you. Along the lines of what you do to make this world a better place, which you do a lot of that, your titles, you have 2 of them, a police psychotherapist, as well as the CopLine Founder and Director. Tell me about both of those.
So I don't think I'd have one without the other. So I knew early on that I wanted to go into the field of psychology. Just wasn't quite sure what had called me. When I was younger, as adolescence, that had really drawn me. And then over time, I actually ended up dating somebody who was an officer and saw a very different side of not just law enforcement, but truly the pain that goes along with the calls, the stressors, the maladaptive behavior that they use to deal with that. As well as, interestingly enough, a history of abuse from childhood that ended up coming into play. And I was young, I was in my early 20s at the time. I was getting my first master's in clinical psych. And this individual had been involved in a near fatal car accident when he was on the job and had lots of physical stuff. But what I hadn't really realized, that obviously came to fruition, is I was, for the first time in my kind of young adult cognitive world, I was looking at PTSD, and more than looking at it, I was now living it with somebody who I absolutely adored. And I remember telling him that, I'm no genius here, but I think he had PTSD, and he and I ended up, going our separate ways or what have you. In probably the past 5 years, I actually, through social media had reconnected, and it was really interesting because one of the things he said to me is, you were really the first person that ever diagnosed me with PTSD. And, and it was just interesting that nobody else had, that this wasn't stuff, and again, it's a lot of years ago, that it hadn't been discussed. So ended up going into a private practice, moved from the West Coast to the East Coast. I had grown up on the East Coast, left when I was 12. So came back, had gotten married. And now I needed to look at kind of the population that was still kind of calling to me. And I started doing ride-alongs when I was out in California. Oh crap, man. I got bitten by that bug hard, really hard. Like there is no game in town like law enforcement. Like, I think one of the guys that I rode with described it as 59 minutes of boredom and 1 minute of sheer terror, and how you just chase that sheer terror. So then I debated whether or not I was going to go into law enforcement, ended up getting engaged, and my husband had made it clear that he was not going to marry somebody in law enforcement, that a close friend of his had died in the line of duty, which was kind of interesting, a one-car motor vehicle accident. So anyway, that wasn't happening. Moved back east and ended up working on the Lower East Side of Manhattan with America's Most Wanted Youth. There are more deaths on 6th and D than any place else. And ran GED programs for them. They had to be part of the juvenile justice system. So I got schooled on the D and really truly learned, honestly enough, that there are lots of similarities in cops and convicts, except at some point in time, somebody took a right-hand turn and somebody took a left-hand turn, or some of my guys will say, I just didn't get caught. But it was a phenomenal experience for me. And then I moved out to Jersey. And once I moved out to Jersey, ended up starting to do ride-alongs out in Jersey, because they weren't doing critical incident debriefings at the time. They weren't doing a whole lot of psychological stuff for law enforcement. So it kind of became my quest. And I just never stopped. And realized at some point in time. So, I was I was every cop's nightmare. I mean, you were going to take a shift and you had a 12-hour shift. So if you did 8, 10, 12 hours, like I took the entire shift with you. So, that my poor guys that were doing midnight shifts were like, what do you mean? like how many hours? And, and I realized that they coop. So I'm sure there's a pillow in the trunk, but, so for the first few hours, they figure I was either put there by their chief or internal affairs. And by like hour 3, they realized clearly nobody had vetted me, because there was no way that anybody had put this in their vehicle. Absolutely, totally politically incorrect, and every other incorrect that there could be. So by the end of a shift, what ended up really happening was a bond, was being able to talk about stuff because of the questions I asked. Really, they must have picked up. I mean, I gave a shit. I had ridden a lot with LAPD and Los Angeles Sheriff's Department when I was out west, and being able to see kind of some of the differences. In my first ride along back east was in a small town. I think they had 12 full-time officers. It's a beach community, so they dropped down to a little under 1,200 during the winter. So it was a midnight shift, dead of winter. And it's probably one of the most difficult emotional ride-alongs that I had. The officer that I rode with talked about an incident that he had 12 years ago. And here's where I started realizing, so most of the guys were patrolling the areas they grew up in. They had been raised in these towns, so that every call was not a Jane or John Doe. It was, this is Aunt Mary's best friend who I used to go over and she used to make me breakfast. This is, John who my dad hung out with. Like, so the emotionally charged component to this town was significant. And this officer described one of the most horrendous child calls that anybody could experience. And he had never spoken about it. And he was just sobbing finally being able to talk about it. And I thought to myself, so for the first 3 hours, I'm not trusted. And for the next 3, I could wear, a color like a priest. And then just thought about how invaluable it is for them to have somebody that gets it. And again, I've never worn that badge and patch. I've never had that honor. I didn't earn it. I still to this day have not earned it. And no matter how close I am, even on CopLine, that I will never rightfully be able to penetrate that outer circle because I've never had to put myself in a situation where I could die to save others. And that was my job. Very different mindset. And I'm well aware of that. So when I was in high school, I had been part of a original peer focus group for teens that one of the people I went to high school with, her mom was a psychologist and worked out of Thalian's Mental Health at Cedars-Sinai. And they decided that they felt a hotline, a teen line for teens answering calls for teens would be incredibly valuable. So active listening skills in Stephanie's life was born when she was 14 years old. And I remember going to one of the psychologist's offices to help her, work on the active listening skills and their manual or what have you. And I think we went live when I was 16. And I always say, when you're 18 years old and you age out of a hotline, you feel like you've got some issues going on. But I stayed very close to the founder of that, who's Dr. Elaine Leader. And so, kind of as you move on into my own life and my career, it was a very normal thought for me as I was doing these ride-alongs, thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if we had a hotline for police officers that could call and talk to other officers? And then, my private practice grew. Not uncommon for a lot of the people that I rode with that realized that I wasn't a flaming liberal that felt that 3 rounds of kumbaya was going to solve their problems. And I said the word fuck a whole lot. So they were cool. So not uncommon that they would call. And typically what they came in for is not what they stayed dealing with. So whatever the initial issues were, that sense of somebody that gets it, kind of the checkup from the neck up, became really normal to them. So it's not uncommon that some of my folks have been with me for over 20 years. Really common. So I was losing a lot of officers untimely to work-related incidents. And the sadness that came out of that was that they were leaving a career that they loved, that they felt like they were making a difference. And obviously, as I went on and I understood law enforcement more, I also realized that confidentiality was the absolute highest hurdle to law enforcement officers seeking help. And the perception of it, it made no difference if it was real or if it wasn't. Their perception is reality. And I got that. So when I thought about doing a hotline, it had to be with retired police officers because I also knew that I wasn't reaching for suicide. And for a general population to hear that freaks people out. When I do the vetting, because I'm always the first round of vetting for retired officers, I have to be very upfront when I vet them, because if there are strong thoughts or feelings, religious reasons, or what have you, it needs to be on the table. They need to make a decision because they're not going to be rogue. I need to do everything in my power to prevent rogue on these lines. So I also knew that I was smart enough to never go into a venture without grabbing somebody who is stupid enough to be your wingman. And Dr. Jay Nagdman was it. Jay and I will tell you that we have no clue when we met, but we clearly met over 20 years ago, over probably 25 years ago. We think it probably had to do with something dealing with probably Teen Line and probably an event that he was at and I was at. But we don't know. But what I do know is that he was the only one that could do what I needed. He was the only one that got it. And for my yin, he's my yang. He is like the monorail, and I am like Cyclops. And you know what? It works. And Jay's expertise, which I know nobody else in the country. So Jay came from the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is the oldest hotline in the United States. And he was the director of that. And then he went on to Los Angeles Police Department, their behavioral science services. So Jay would have the knowledge, he would have the insight, he had the personality, he had what was going to be needed, because this was going to be a miracle. This was one of those things that if CopLine was to make it, was going to take something that we were grabbing from beyond logic. And I think, I truly do believe that the secret ingredient is love. And, I know this campy shit, but it is. It's the love that my retired officers have for their fellow officers and their families. It's love that came from me for a population and a respect that I had not worn that badge. It was an understanding from a private practice where there was carnage, that my job was to try and make sense of the senseless and help them piece together a life. And that those pieces were not going to fit exactly how they had been, but it didn't mean that their life was going to be worse. That some of those changes and those pieces not fitting back were going to be essential for their own growth. And it was with all of this that CopLine was born and still exists today. And I also knew that I wasn't going to be able to take government money. So, so again, high hurdles of making sure that the integrity of these lines would always be maintained. And I remember this gentleman, and I would always love for him to hear a podcast or whatever. He called from Connecticut every year. Okay, so CopLine was founded in 2005. And I would say from like 2007 on, every year he would call and say, we're just seeing, I think they had like a 211 or 311, whatever it was in Connecticut. We're just seeing whether or not you're up and operating up. This year, I think we're going to get funding. I had, I have no idea how I was getting the funding. Speed ahead to 2016, to June, which was a Pulse shooting in Florida. And I remember thinking to myself, this is ridiculous. The phones were ringing into my office, that I needed to pull the phones off of my office, and I needed to get a separate phone, mobile phone, to have it ring onto, and then I would keep it. Because there's no advertising, we weren't getting calls, I wasn't sure it ever rang. Except for that lovely man from, I think, 211 in Connecticut. It always rang for him. So I tried to get it off of the lines, and the phone company, it took forever. It did not make it off. Now go to July 7th of 2016, the Dallas 5. I was sitting in my office and the phone rang, and I see Dallas, the word Dallas came up. I had known about the shooting. I was with a patient, told my patient I needed to answer the phone, answered the phone, And it was a female, I assume an officer, who was screaming, very emotional, in tears. And she's screaming and she said, "They're killing my brothers and sisters. You've got to do something. I beg of you. They're killing my brothers and sisters. You've got to help." And I thought to myself, this is the moment. I'm either going to shit or get off the pot. That I had the ability to help. I had the ability to pull these lines off. And at this point needed to believe that if you build it, they will come. And was able to, called the phone company. I was no longer kind. That I had gone from the B's to the C's at that time. And I figured I'd start with like the head of, the CEO of the company and work my way down. So finally was able to get those lines off. And for 2 weeks had the counseling team out in California that helped, that they took those lines. So I didn't have to, because I was still running a full-time private practice. And then after that, I was kind of thrown into, you're going to have to do this. And I had met this incredible assistant chief, Sarah Creighton from San Diego, who headed her wellness. You and I were at a conference that both of us had been invited to in DC. And she and I had stayed close. Well, Sarah called me up and she's like, Sarah's just awesome. Sarah is just the real deal. And Sarah's like, "I'm going to be retiring in January or in February." She's like, "CopLine needs to be up and running. We need to do a training. I can arrange it in San Diego. When can you come out here to talk about it?" I think within inside of 3 weeks, I got on a plane. Before I sat down, we were on the phone with Jay Nagdeman, and we were now committing to a date in April. No money, absolutely no funding, and just figured we got to do something. So that was it. And I will tell you, and Jay, probably gets embarrassed, but that first training, Jay gets paid, that he turned around and gave back the paycheck. But that's CopLine. That's the heart that has kept us going and still to this day exists. And I think it's what the volunteers love. I think it's what they pick up on. I think they realize that none of us are full of shit. I think they realize that none of us are getting paid. We get reimbursed for expenses. Don't get me wrong. Some of them, at least. And Jay still needs to get paid, but LAPD has been incredible at putting him on loan for us as well. So just been amazing. Just truly been amazing to watch.
What an absolutely incredible journey you've been on. So very interesting. And it's a small world. I don't know if you know this or not, but Sarah Creighton was I had known her for many years, and then I worked directly for her. She was my lieutenant when I was a vice detective, and I didn't work for a sergeant. I actually worked for her as a lieutenant. And later on, she became the captain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was on our peer support team for 22 years. And so when she came aboard, I'm working for her as being on the peer support team. She's an amazing lady. And I mean that with a capital L lady. She's just all around just amazing. So that's cool that you got to meet her and she was so influential in CopLine. And
she was in that first, and she got the group together. She made sure that we had, asses in seats, and she made all the arrangements to make that happen. She actually had the chief at the time call LAPD's chief to get Jay sent over. It was just, but that was Sarah, but that's the caliber of people that are truly attracted to CopLine.
Yeah.
And when you sit in the trainings, you just realize, wow, it's amazing to sit in the room with people, that have done so much and so much good and still want to give back. Just incredible. Just incredible.
Yeah. It's cool stuff. So let me ask you this. When we talk about de-escalation. A lot of people have different views about de-escalation. So when we talk about the term, what's kind of your view on de-escalation when you think of that term, and what's the lens that you look through for that?
So it's interesting. So I look through two lenses. I look through the lens as a therapist for my own patients when it comes to de-escalating stuff at home. So that's probably my primary lens. If they're in my office and there's substance abuse, there's fighting, there's communication issues. So that becomes an issue in private practice. But the macro piece of it, not the micro in my world, is dealing with officers in de-escalating use of force. In a lot of the courses that they're taking in the de-escalation. And it immediately brings hypervigilance and fear because of my officers being so concerned should they use deadly force and they didn't de-escalate, that it's going to cost them and their families everything they ever worked for. So those are my two pieces on de-escalation.
Yeah, and a very valid concern. And having myself been involved in 2 fatal OISs, I get that. In my first one, there was no time to de-escalate because the suspect was already pointing a gun at us. And then the second one, they were trying to de-escalate through emergency negotiation team, and it just turned out to be not effective. But there's a lot of people experience situations requiring de-escalation, and a lot of our listeners, they range from school teachers, law enforcement, firefighters, medical services, flight attendants, security guards. And whether you're in a classroom dealing with misbehavior, or a law enforcement officer dealing with uncooperative people, or medical services being in a home delivering hospice to grandpa and the family is emotionally upset. There's a lot of situations requiring de-escalation. I'm just curious, when you and I have talked before about the tools that you've found to be effective in these situations, one of them you talked about was addressing symptoms. Tell me more about that.
So interesting. So the patient that I saw just before doing the podcast is now retired from a dual career. He's retired first sergeant and retired from the United States Army, and then retired as a sergeant from the police department. He's done over 40 years of service with both. And we were looking at, he was easy to diagnose with PTSD. PTSD is kind of, I don't really think that that's necessarily too difficult to diagnose, given specific incidents and kind of changes that one goes through afterwards. But I also knew that he'd been exposed to, and he had done 4 combat tours. So I also knew that he was exposed to not just the psychological pieces, but the physical and physiological pieces as well. So I have developed, with the help of leaders in the industry, a concussion intake. So when he was there, we did this concussion intake. Oh, holy crap. I mean, it's just, we're just looking at each other, and he was laughing. It's like, yeah, so much for you getting rid of me after retirement. It's just, there's some truth to it. But the piece on emotional lability is so key for my officers. And I'm going to actually give you, because I think it's just a brilliant description of what emotional lability is. If you don't mind, of course, I also need to be able to.
I don't mind. And I want you to say that second word really slowly, because I'm not sure I'm catching it.
Yep. It's lability, LABILITY, lability. And what emotional lability is it refers to a rapid, often exaggerated change in mood where strong emotions or feelings, uncontrollable laughing or crying, or heightened irritability or temper occur. These very strong emotions are sometimes expressed in a way that is greater than the person's emotions. So the situation didn't call for the level of emotion that you're seeing.
Okay.
So as we went down this very voluminous checkoff list with, some loss of consciousness, others non-loss of consciousness, the subconcussive blows from flashbangs, from being a breacher, from, he goes, you didn't include grenades. I'm like, you're right. I didn't. My bad. I'm like, RPGs. He goes, yep, that would be the type of grenade, but yep, there are other grenades. And so you're kind of looking at this. And then when you're now we're piecing it all together, and the behavioral pieces, the cognitive pieces, the memory loss, the stuff that when he and I begun our journey together, which is probably 15 years ago, we didn't look at them. We just looked at the symptoms that were clear with post-traumatic stress disorder. And he has gotten better. But part of that is also bringing in others. So his wife is a key component. So the de-escalation piece is here, is helping educate his wife on that 6-week period. So with critical incidents and incident dates, I think I always mention that they're not anniversary dates, because anniversary dates have hopefully a positive connotation and incident dates do not. So that typically 6 weeks before an incident to 2 weeks after those incident dates, that symptoms are typically exacerbated. So being able to help spouses, children, depending on ages, loved ones that are going to be exposed to this individual, they need to be very aware and kind of mark down in a calendar 6 weeks before. Because when concentration starts to go, when irritability, outbursts of anger, sleep is typically affected. And we know when sleep's affected, so is the irritability and outbursts of anger. Like, it just kind of all ties in. And to be able to figure it out and make sense of the senseless is so important. So now add on to that a potential for a brain injury or a post-concussive brain. And we know that we're going to have that emotional lability, not just during those incident date periods. We know that memory that's going to be affected. We now need to look at the possibility that memory is affected not from a psychological piece, but a potential for a physiological piece, a brain injury. So being able to work with his spouse and tell them when they are escalating, one of the best ways to deal with it is to give them their space. Because not uncommon, and I was talking about this in session, not uncommon that the spouse wants to be there in this incredibly loving, wonderful way for their spouse that's having a rough time, and they want them to talk about it. Mm-hmm. No, that is not going to work. So being able to help educate them and say, this isn't a psychological piece. This is a physiological. You need to look at what it's like to have frontal lobe damage so that you can understand that you can't love your loved one enough to do this. So I know that Frank Gifford, thank God, who's lived, a full life, did donate his brain, and he did have CTE. CTE cannot be diagnosed, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Certainly made front page with the NFL. And Will Smith's doing a brilliant job in the movie depicting Bennett Amalu, who had come up with the, I believe it's pronounced tau protein. It's TAU protein, which is what's developed for CTE. And we can't diagnose it. You have to be dead in order to do the pathology on a brain. But what we do, Dr. Robert Cantu, has been studying concussions, is over as part of the group that's doing the research. And he has come up with a criteria for TES, traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. And being able to help loved ones see that if this is what's going on, we know what can be kind of expected. And one of the things that one can expect is a shrinking of the brain. And so, we need psychiatrists to understand that you need to do a really good concussion background, because the medications that you're potentially prescribing for psychological injuries and memory deficits, which post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulty concentrating, difficulty with memory is there, those medications are very different than those that would be prescribed for somebody who is experiencing memory loss due to a shrinking of the brain. That's where your Alzheimer's meds and your dementia meds now come into play. So helping a spouse understand what's going on, how to best navigate it. If it's PTSD, we know that's 6 and 2, 6 weeks before to 2 weeks after. But if it's something deeper, then we need to also educate them on brain injuries. And there's an incredible website called Brainline. We might be CopLine, but found brainline.org does a brilliant job, absolutely phenomenal job at being able to look at brain injuries and have suggestions on just what you're talking about, the de-escalation, on how do you live with somebody with a brain injury.
So if you're watching this on video on YouTube or Facebook, Instagram, any of those platforms, LinkedIn platforms, you can look in the show notes, and we'll have these links in there for CopLine, any of the other websites or resources mentioned.
Awesome.
If you're listening to this, then come back to the show notes, because that's where you'll find that stuff. So if you're driving, don't worry about it. We've got this documented for you. We'll have it available for you when you get to wherever you're headed. Let me ask you this, Stephanie. One of the tools that you've found to be effective in de-escalating or dealing with angry people is you said leaving the situation.
Mm-hmm.
What is an effective way to leave the situation without having the other person think it's the end of the relationship, or that you don't care, or that leaving them with the feeling that they're being abandoned? How do you navigate that?
So leaving doesn't necessarily mean leaving the house, but I'm going to tell you that if there is a potential for violence, both parties are going to want that person to leave the house, because the person that potentially escalates to a point of violence has absolutely horrendous regret afterwards. And the person that's the receiver of the abuse is also absolutely overwhelmed and now has to make some horrendous decisions, because most of the time they love the person and they don't understand the violence. So being able to say to somebody, so if it doesn't escalate to violence, and if it hasn't in the past, and I would tell you, just like when you're in law enforcement, past behavior is a predictor of future behavior. So profile. It's kind of, when you guys go out to calls with mentally ill, when mentally ill patients are off of their psych meds, they typically escalate the same way they always have. So if you are hearing voices from the TV telling you to kill the dog, and that's typically, they get auditory hallucinations. Now, if you walk into a home and they're seeing stuff, it's your moment of saying, maybe they took something. Maybe they're hallucinating because they got a hold of something else, because this has never been. So if the person's never been violent, I would be unsure why all of a sudden they would become violent. Obviously, you make sure that you're safe. But to be able to say to somebody, I can see how incredibly angry you are, and anything I say is just going to piss you off more. I'm going to go into the other room. Take whatever time you need. I'm here. So
yeah, that's great.
Great. It's being able to tell them, I love you and I'm going to give you what you need. My kids, because I used to have the nasty habit, and okay, so now you're going to find out I'm not perfect, that when I get pissed off, I'd like hang up. I'm like, I'm just done. My kids would be like, Mom, you can't hang up. I'm like, you're right. So then I would say to them, just so you know, I'm so pissed off, I'm hanging up the phone right now, just so you're aware. They're like, all right. But I think they felt less abandoned by me, truthfully. And I think that was actually important. And I do the same thing on the hotline, when we train, that retired officers, that our volunteers are not to be abused, that law enforcement has been abused enough. That is not what they're volunteering for. They do not need to put up with shit. They do not need to put up with an abusive drunk. They have done that forever. That you can say to the person, I can hear how angry you are, and this is not going to be fruitful for either one of us. Please call back when you're sober, or have had less to drink, or when you are not angry. Please call back, but I'm not going to stay on the line to be abused. Yeah, I feel very, very strongly about that.
And that's wonderful advice. I like that. And I like that aspect that you carry for the CopLine listeners. What they're there for and what they're not there for. So let me ask you a question about CopLine. I think there's a lot of officers that might feel like, if I call CopLine, what I'm going through isn't that big of a deal. I don't want to bother them. I don't want to tie up a listener for me. And it's almost like a self-minimization. So if you're looking at a teeter-totter on a children's playground, what's the tipping point? When should I call CopLine and when should I not?
So a pretty simple rule of thumb. I remember I had a kidney stone. You're going to be like, what the hell does a kidney stone have to do about calling CopLine? I digress. And I remember saying, so I found out that the kidney stone was caused because I was training for a sentry on a bike. And so I had become dehydrated. And so I remember saying to the guy that I was training with, I'm like, he's like, you're not drinking enough. I'm like, I don't know when to drink. He goes, if you think you drink. I mean, and that was like, should I take a drink? Well, at that point, the answer is yes. If you are thinking that you should be taking a drink of water, take the damn drink of water. If you are thinking, do I call CopLine? That's it. That is it. That's your tipping point. Because throughout your day, typically you're not thinking to yourself, I wonder if I should call a hotline. So if you're thinking that, that says there's something going on that we want to hear. Everybody thinks that if I don't have a gun in one hand and a bottle of Jack in the other, I'm not suicidal. We've missed a whole lot if that's our threshold. If we have a safe place where officers can call and not have to worry about repercussions, we should be able to prevent that suicidal caller down the line. So that person that calls us for low-hanging fruit, relationship issue, fight with the spouse, working too much overtime, the supervisor that's an asshole, the being passed over for promotion, the public that has now turned on them, the low-hanging fruit. If they have a good experience, if they call and they just can blow off steam, we also know that when it becomes more significant, they'll call back. IA complaints, the fear of losing a job, the fear of not being able to support the family, officer-involved shooting where the officer was killed, their partner, a child was killed. The cumulative stuff, if we have a safe place to deal with that, we should be able to start to combat the suicide rates.
Yeah. And we absolutely need as high of a level as first responder suicides are. We absolutely do. And if you're listening to this, again, you don't have a opportunity to glance at the show notes right away, but you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I think Stephanie and Carrie are talking to me or about me. They're talking to me about needing to call. That it's a simple number. It's 1-800-267-5463. 267-5463.
Which is 1-800-CopLine.
1-800-CopLine. And just don't wait.
Yeah.
If you think you need to drink, you need to drink. We're talking water.
Exactly.
If you think you need to call, you need to call.
Yep.
Well, that's awesome.
And we had some wonderful calls that are obviously not lethal. I think the sweetest call that I had heard was a officer's daughter who is in her 30s. Her father had passed away a few years before. And she just wanted, honestly, just somebody who she could talk to that would be similar to her dad to run something by. And the volunteer that took that call said to me, he said, all I could think about was when I'm no longer here, that I hope that my daughter calls to talk to one of our guys when she's struggling with something and they can listen. So 95% of our calls are just bad day calls, or just kind of stressors that officers are dealing with. Not uncommon that officers are calling on their way home. Kind of, it's a nice place to just be able to get shit off your shoulders, so that you can go home, you can enjoy your time with your family, which is always so limited, and be able to be with somebody that gets it.
Yeah. Well, and what's awesome is on the other end of every phone call to CopLine, you're going to have a vetted, retired police officer to make sure that you're not only just heard, but you're understood. And, someone who has at least 10 years of experience, who retired in good standing, who's been through significant training. And if you want to know more about that CopLine training, check out the De-Escalation Conversations episode with Chuck Stringham, who's the head of the training for CopLine. And he talks about that. And Stephanie, I'm so glad that you were able to be here with us. And thank you for sharing your journey. And thank you for sharing that story about the daughter that called. Barely able to talk right now. I'm choked up. And that's the essence of CopLine is cops being there for other cops, and not just cops, not just active duty and retired cops, but for their families as well. Yeah. So maybe you're not in law enforcement, but you know somebody who is. You're listening to this episode. Let them know. 1-800-CopLine. It's free. It's 100% confidential, and it's effective. So thank you, Stephanie, for being here. Any last thoughts before we wrap this episode up?
No, I'm grateful. I'm grateful to you to doing these podcasts to help us get the word out, for having done the career that you did and still wanting to pay forward and making a difference. Thank you. Thank you for being part of the solution.
Thank you. I appreciate that. To our listeners, again, 1-800-COPLINE, copline.org. The rest of the things that we talked about will be in the show notes. So check that out. And while you're there, please be sure to like and subscribe and hit that little notification bell thingy so you know that when a new episode drops. And every Monday at 6 a.m. Pacific, a new episode of De-Escalation Conversations will be coming out with a wide variety of guests. Thank you, Stephanie, for being here. And to our listeners, as always, stay safe.